Hello, everybody. If I could interrupt your conversations and get your attention. Thank you very much for coming to the first of 8 sessions that we have carefully curated for you in this Translation Across Disciplines Conference 2024. We look forward to this afternoon and the keynote at 5, along with all of the events that we have planned tomorrow. Thank you all of you who are here from Brown, faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates who are participating. Thank you for those who have come from afar, and I apologize for the really cold Providence weather today, but it'll get better tomorrow. I'm not sure if Kirsty and Jill can hear me, but I will say thank you to them again at the keynote, but they've been really helpful. Our center manager and our academic manager, very helpful. The media services people are really patient and diligent, and for that, I'm also very thankful. And I have a lot of other colleagues at the Center for Language Studies that I'd like to thank, like Elsa Belmont-Flores and Catherine King. And my last colleague is going to be the moderator for the session, and this is Jeremy Lanin as the Associate Director of the Center for Language Studies from Portuguese and Brazilian Studies and the Director of the Brazil Initiative. Thank you, Jeremy. Welcome.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. And thank you to everyone for being here. Today, we're going to keep the introductions of our panelists brief. Their information, of course, is online, and I know that everybody's looked at the schedule, so you can find more information there. So we're going to follow the program, and we're going to start with Esther Whitfield from Brown University in the Department of Comparative Literature and Hispanic Studies. So, Esther, I'll pass that to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a little daunting to be on a panel with such distinguished translators. I'm a little bit of a translator, but I do think about translation a lot. I do teach translation. And I'm going to talk about the research and translation I've done around Guantanamo in Cuba. A number of people here have heard much of this before, so I apologize in advance and hope those who haven't will also have some questions. So I'm mostly for the past 10 years, I've been working on the question of Guantanamo, partly the US naval station at Guantanamo, partly the parts of Cuba that border Guantanamo. This is an anti-imperialist propaganda message against the Americans at the base that is from the Cuban border, the town that borders the base in the east of Cuba. The base is, of course, in Cuba, and here's a map of how exactly it borders Cuba. This dotted line is a fence line that is sown with landmines, that is not passable at all, and that is an extremely dangerous situation. So it's this sort of very weird borderland, that I've been thinking about a lot, mostly as a scholar of Cuba. So the base is just an interesting space, this interesting social space, a terrifying social space first, but an interesting social space for a number of reasons, partly because of the many different kinds of people who live there in this very small 45 square mile area. These include primarily, most importantly, and I think, are certainly on everybody's minds, they have 780 men who have passed through there as detainees in the so-called War on Terror. There are just under 30 still there. So this is one sort of social space at Guantanamo. Another is the US military. For example, many sort of US military police battalions have passed through there on short-term deployments. They both work and play, as it's very much advertised to the military as a space of leisure, a space where you can go scuba diving, a space where you can hang out. It's also a space where there are a number of civilians, largely because of US Navy families who've lived there for a much longer time. This is the McDonald's, the only McDonald's on the island of Cuba, and this is the high school. So it's just a very, very bizarre space. There are also a number of Cubans there. This is Senator Marco Rubio visiting the Cubans who live on the base. They are Cubans who, in the 1960s, when Cuba and the US broke diplomatic relations, they were people who worked on the base, and they were given the choice: do you want to live in Cuba or on the base? They decided to live on the base, and they basically spent their whole lives on the base. They've grown old on the base. They have the opportunity to move to the US if they want to, but on the base, they are guaranteed housing and healthcare in perpetuity from the US Navy. So it's different to be an elderly person on the base than it is to be an elderly person on the mainland US, and most of them have stayed there. So this is a sort of a big picture of the kinds of people who are there, but I think one of the things that really stands out, particularly for the questions of this conference today, is how many languages are spoken at the base and the great need for translation. I mean, I think these other sort of constituencies I've shown you, it's mostly English and Spanish. There are a lot of Filipino workers there as well as Jamaican workers there, so there's that sort of expands the language pool. But among the detainees held at the prisons on the naval base, there have been as many as 17 different languages spoken. These are detainees who are citizens or residents of about 40 different countries. So it is very sort of multilingual. The detention centers at the base of these very multilingual spaces. Having said that, Arabic and Pashto are the main languages, but there are many others too. So there's been this great need for translators. And for translators in these sort of very difficult interactions between the US military and the detainees, as well as between the detainees and their lawyers. Detainees were allowed legal defense as of 2005, having been without that since 2002. So there's a lot of translators. And I want to sort of focus a little bit on the kinds of things that come up in translation in a context like this, before moving more specifically to the question of literary translation and Guantanamo. John Sifton, who is an attorney, one of many attorneys who worked at the base, has this sort of useful and very sort of poignant comment. He says, frequent mistranslations by interpreters had significant effects on detainees' freedom at Guantanamo. So his statement, very consequential statement. And the reality was that there were so many translators, so many languages, translation teams brought together at the last minute without very, very much training, that there were actually a lot of mistakes. Here's one of the most consequential, one of the most best known consequential mistakes is this one. This is pre-Guantanamo, but it ends up at Guantanamo. So at a US military interrogation site in Pakistan in 2002, an interrogator asks Emad Hassan, who's a Yemeni, do you have any connection to Al-Qaeda? The translator translates this into the Arabic that this translator is capable of. Do you have any connection to Al-Qaeda? Hassan says yes. Hassan is from a town called Al-Qaeda in Yemen. As Newsweek reported, a botched translation landed Hassan in Guantanamo for 15 years. So these are the sort of, if we're on a panel like social justice and translation, there are high consequences to mistranslation. I think this is one of the many. Just a few, I think there are other ways in which translating at Guantanamo became both a sort of challenging and in a deeply sort of effective interpersonal process, and I'll give a couple of examples of that. Some of the translators at Guantanamo have written memoirs. They've sort of documented their experiences there. One is Mavish Rukhsana Khan, who was a US-born daughter of Afghan immigrants who volunteered as a translator for one of the pro bono legal teams and worked with a lot of elderly Afghanis who are detained at Guantanamo. And it's an interesting memoir, and I think one of the sort of main points it makes is how very much these people she was translating for reminded her of her grandparents. It's very much a way of thinking about translation as a way to forge these very deep interpersonal relationships in a very hostile context. Somewhat less sort of positive is the memoir of Eric Saar. So Eric Saar was a military linguist specializing in Arabic. And he was called on to translate from English to Arabic both in sort of general day-to-day interactions on the cell blocks, but also in some extremely brutal interrogations. Eventually, he actually resigned from the US military because he felt that his role as a translator was too compromising. He couldn't really be sort of defending what he was translating, and so he resigned. But he says some things that I think are quite interesting in terms of thinking about translation in a space like this. He says guards on the blocks had a special loathing for linguists. They saw linguists as sympathizers, a term at Gitmo that included anyone who betrayed signs of compassion or empathy for the captives or talked to them a little too long. So I think he really develops the idea of the translator as a kind of intermediary who cannot not develop compassion as they translate between these two languages and these two sort of very different worldviews. Okay, so that's some sort of big picture of different kinds of translation at Guantanamo. I mean, one thing that emerges from this, surprisingly and against all the odds, is a piece of literary translation that some of you may know of. This is a collection by Mark Folkoff, who is a lawyer and an English PhD, and a sort of guy who's very interested in both literature and law, who was a lawyer for a number of detainees at Guantanamo. And in 2007, he published pieces of poetry that had been gathered from detainees. And I think for a group of translators, the way this came to be and the kinds of obstacles to it are really, really eye-opening in a lot of ways. So first of all, these were poems that were originally not written on paper because there was no paper. A lot of them were carved on styrofoam cups. A lot of them carved in Arabic on styrofoam cups and then given to the lawyers. When the lawyers collected these and wanted to publish them, they had to go through all kinds of permissions processes with the US military, to the extent that a huge number of them were confiscated. One other thing about this is that the originals are still classified. So what one has when you read this book, it's a really slim book. It has about 30 poems in it. One reads this knowing that most of it is not there, including the originals. So you can sort of be kind of frustrated reading the English and wanting to sort of refer to the original, but there is no way of reading the original. So it's very sort of limited, compromise, but I think, very significant form of translation. So I'm going to step back a bit and say a little bit about how I have, related to this. So I'm going to time myself here so I'm almost at 10. I'm going to just race through this. Okay, so I work on Cuba. I was sort of looking at this book of poetry, thinking, nobody's really thinking about the fact that this is in Cuba. Some people, Fidel Castro was, but most people were not thinking about this being in Cuba. And I started reading the poems and was sort of really very, very troubled by the fact that the sort of Cuba piece was always an afterthought. And then I read the final poem in the collection, which is by a former detainee called Ibrahim El-Rubaish. It's this very beautiful poem about looking out from a cell at the sea. It's the Caribbean Sea. And one of the things he says as he addresses the sea is, doesn't Cuba, the vanquished, translate its stories for you? So this seemed to me a real way of trying to engage Cuba, trying to think of a sort of translation process with Cuba as a form of some kind of solidarity. Many people here have heard about my obsession with that, what vanquished might be in the original. I keep thinking, is it this Cuban, is it something that would correspond to the Cuban verb vencer, which means to overcome? Because if it is, it's in some ways a political mistranslation, because in Cuba, you only ever conjugate vencer in the future. It's only ever, we will vanquish. There's no possibility for a vanquished Cuba within the rhetoric of the Cuban Revolution. But this is super interesting to me. And I started also reading the work of the Cuban poet Jose Ramon Sanchez, who's the editor, lives in Eastern Cuba, is the editor of a journal where he's published a lot of poetry. And Sanchez has written about over 100 poems imagining what it is to be at the naval base in Cuba, to be a prisoner in Cuba. He sort of is over the border imagining this. A colleague and I have translated his collection of poems about Guantanamo. And I will show you one of them that I think in some ways is the most useful in terms of thinking about the kind of empathic process he is trying to engage in. Here's this poem called The Black Arrow. And it's a sort of scene in which he is thinking about, what it is to be a prisoner wanting to pray, not knowing where Mecca is. It's actually a reference to a point in the history of detentions when the military actually did put black arrows on the floors of detention cells so people could pray. But he's thinking about the absence of this. And I think he's doing this in the kind of language, and certainly in kind of coordinate numerical sort of language that was super weird as to read and translate, as a way of thinking about their difficulties. But this would be an example. And I think finally, I was very much thinking about how do these spaces connect? What kind of possibilities are there for connection and translation across this border? And thinking about translation as potentially a way of addressing this. And then a couple of years ago, Jose Ramon Sanchez actually met Ahmed Errachidi, who was also a detainee and wrote a memoir. He's a Moroccan detainee, or he's a chef and a former detainee from Morocco. And Jose and I did a reading of Jose's poetry in translation. This is in Austria. Ahmed Errachidi wanted to know about what it was like to be in Cuba, knowing that there were detainees at the base. And he actually said to Jose Ramon at one point, if I had known that you were there, it would have been a different experience for me. And my retroactive sort of reflections on my experience are now changed by knowing that you were there. So it felt to me as if there was a real, that this sort of translation in a bigger sense, this sort of translation as an attempt to connect and understand another's experience, was something that was on the minds of both of these people. And this conversation, which I was really honored to translate, was something of a corroboration of that. I think I did 15 and I will stop there. Thank you very much. Thanks.
In my excitement to get to you all, I forgot to say that the panel's title is, of course, Translation and Social Justice. So to rewind just for a moment. So our next speaker today is Kola Tubosun. So if I can introduce you, the publisher of Olongo Africa and the founder of Yoruba Name.com. So.
Let's refresh. Okay, it's good. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Give me a second here. Make sure the time is. Hello. Happy to be here. It's my second time in Providence. I'm happy to be back here. Speaking about something that the mic? How do I do that? Sorry. Do I pull it back up? It's good? Okay, thank you. My name is Kola, and I want to speak a bit about my work in translation, but also how it fits into this idea of social justice and how I see my role, both as a linguist and also as a creative writer and translator. I pass this around, by the way. If anybody who has it, I'm going to give you some more when I'm done. This is the most latest book that I'm a co-editor on, and it's called The Best Translations Anthology. It's focused on work published in English from around the world and published in the USA. So this is coming out in April by Deep Vellum. But most of the work I've done, especially in Nigerian languages, have to do with getting creative work published from English into African languages. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the language situation in Nigeria and Africa that makes this something I find very important and very relevant. So this was a publication we had last year to mark the International Mother Tongue Day. And what we did was have 10 short stories published by Africans, translated into 10 different African languages by African translators, and then having someone read them, provide the audio narration of that story and then shared widely through, social media and stuff like that. And the reason we did this is the conviction that having, African literature be usually interpreted as only literature written in English was causing enormous damage to African languages. Most of you here can mention, 5, so African writers, and usually they are writers who write in English. And they're not the only ones producing literature on the continent, but they're the most prominent ones because that's what the business wants. And in doing that, because of a number of reasons, colonialism, globalization, lack of efforts in creating technological tools to be able to write in many of these languages, the enormous effect it's had on African languages is detrimental. And so over time, there have been efforts here and there have been translations. Many writers like Soyinka had tried to translate work from African languages into English. Again, this is something that typically happens, and we've seen many people try to translate into English, and I do that as well. But translating from English back into African languages is something that hasn't been very common or very popular. And so in the end, I used to be a linguist at Google, so I have done some work in language technology. One thing I've realized is that the absence of texts that are properly written, properly formatted in many of these languages contribute more to the absence of speech tools in these languages more than just the idea that people don't speak language to their children. So now Siri, which most people use on their phones, or Google Assistant, exists in almost every big world languages, but also in languages that are not very big. So I usually mention Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, etc. Those 5 Nordic languages are like maybe 25 million or so in total, like 5 different languages. Siri exists in each of them, but Yoruba, which I speak, which is spoken by about 50 million people, doesn't have Siri in that language. And the reason why, of course, people can say, oh, it's racist, or it's just people just don't care about many of these languages. But the companies that are creating these tools are looking for. They don't have the data that they need. A lot of expense to put into these spaces to create, this work. And the work we are doing as linguists to make sure this helps, improves, is to create the data. Create the data so that when the big tech companies want to do the work, they already have some data. There's translations in French, German, Italian, many of these languages already have many of the major texts of the world, Shakespeare, Bible, etc., etc. But many of African languages don't. So creating tools, story projects like this help us generate corpus for these languages and hopefully help change the future. So this is one example of one of those stories written by my friend Sarah Ladipo Mayika, and then translated into Shona, which is a language of Zimbabwe. And then we have an audio which someone reads out. So in this way, we hope that we can reach more people. And I'll get back to it in a bit. This is what Nigerian languages, the Nigerian language map looks like. So there's so many languages. There are about 521 official languages in Nigeria that exist, though many of them are endangered, some of them are extinct, but we don't know how many are extinct, how many are endangered, because again, the census documents in Nigeria don't ask for how many languages people speak. They rather ask for like what's your ethnic group, what's your religion, and stuff like that. And a lot of researchers who used to come to do work in Nigeria haven't done that recently. Go to Ethnologue, you're going to get the result that not many. They don't know how many people speak many of these languages, so there is no access to data. And yet, when you think of Nigeria or Nigerian literature, English is typically what you hear as the language of creativity. So this was a work I published in 2021, which is a collection of poetry. It's poetry written by a professor in Pennsylvania, Emily Grosholz, and she's published it in English. I think she published it about 10 or so years ago. And I translated all the poems into Yoruba, and that was that. Here was a translation of Haruki Murakami's short story titled Confessions of a Shinagawa Monkey, a story that I really enjoyed reading. And we got him to agree to have it published in Yoruba, which was, in his words, the first time the writer himself is being published in any African language. And my hope is that by showing how this can be done and encouraging many more African writers and translators to translate not just from their language into English, but from English and many global writers into their own languages, they help in many ways to preserve and benefit those languages. This was my translation of a story by Chimamanda Adichie. And I mentioned this earlier, a number of reasons we do this. Corpus building, because many of these languages don't have data for people to use. I've mentioned that earlier. Translation, I've mentioned that earlier. Dictionaries are also important because, again, there's not a lot of research happening. And because of a lot of absences in the past, it's like you're starting from the scratch. And you need to have data and then build on top of that. Language revitalization, orthography as well. Many of the languages we worked on don't even have a writing system, or some of them have different writing systems, and you need to harmonize. And by letting people be able to translate and work in them, they eventually come to a way to describe and find a way to write the language out. And hopefully that also benefits language technologies in the future. I talk about empowering translators, make the stories more available to people in the native languages, and so on and so on. And also improve the teaching of those languages as well. I think that's basically all I have to say about this. I'm going to take more questions much later, and any other thing you have to say, I would respond to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kala. And to finish, we have J.D. Pluker, writer, translator, artist based out of Houston, Texas. So.
Okay, just before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you to Jane and to Sawako and all the organizers of this conference. I don't know how close I'm going to hold this a little further. And to all the tech people, my friend who was doing the recording and the other tech person whose name I'm forgetting, but they were amazing. And often it is very complicated to do, so I am very appreciative to them. And then I also wanted to mention that I, from my home here back in Texas, was following the work of hunger strikers here at Brown at the beginning of February. And I don't know if some of you are in the room or are friends with some of the people who were doing that, who went on hunger strike in early February to ask Brown, or to demand Brown divest from companies profiting off the genocide in Palestine. And I think it's important, especially at a translation and social justice panel, to perhaps begin there and to bring it into the conversation. My talk today is revolving around bodies. And so this idea that these individuals chose, and this collective of individuals chose to put their bodies on the line and to risk their bodies and to think about all of the people whose bodies are at risk today in Palestine and in the struggle against the genocide. So now we'll begin. Or maybe we already began. The returns. I shake. Today she begins con las traducidas and the untranslated or ultra-translated women. Se van a ir intercalando. Question emerged. You immediately answered unsuccessfully. Joy of. Which side should she go on today, the men's or the women's? Searching desperately for a place to go at the airport, waiting for half an hour by the doors to the family restrooms. One down the hall, the other right here by her, but the doors never open, losing hope today she begins with, what is it to lose hope and to keep going? 3, you're writing insubstantial then. You were walking through disaster zone. 4, whew, the shaking. She's staring at the floor. Is a transition another kind of translation? Is a translation another kind of transition? A transmogrification, a monstering, a paratactical gap. She wants a language for what was always there inside. A transition is used to move from one paragraph to another in a traditional essay format. A transition sentence to lead her out of one paragraph and into another. She's rereading Lynn Heginian this morning, Que en paz descanse, her essay, The Rejection of Closure. She lands, not a transition, but a paratactical gap. A shift necessitates a recovery, a looking behind, and a new structure, a stepping forward. Sizable gaps between units, the recovery of information, looking behind, and the discovery of newly structured ideas, stepping forward. Five. She wakes up at 5:34 a.m. and starts thinking again. With the thinking, repeat the thinking. She thinks there will be a way out of this time. The how could she, and the how did she, and why did she, and did she need to? The I accept it, and she doesn't accept me, and she fucked it up, and all the she can't believes. All the thoughts swirl, and the she's not enough louder every minute. She doesn't want a pill to take all this away. And this living, but maybe she does. She doesn't know her way out of the weeds. She's in them again. Look, mad desire generates a not knowing. She wrote that weeks ago. A mad desire to know and to understand, to embody, to not harm, but also not to just go along, to accept when she should not accept. Will she know the rivers? How to know which rivers are hers, which rivers are your rivers, and how does she know when she's crossing them? Sometimes the rivers are deep and wide, and she knows. Sometimes the rivers are very small, not rivers, more like creeks or tiny rivulets. When did she arrive to that river? She thinks, is it even a river? An invisible river? An impossible rivulet? Wait, when did I cross the river? She thinks. 6, possibility in absence, hours like decades, light on, feathers unseen. You denied translation was too difficult. 7, what you see is most definitely not what you get. 8, she is indefinitely other in herself. That is undoubtedly the reason she is called temperamental, incomprehensible, perturbed, capricious, not to mention her language in which she goes off in all directions. She spent so many years translating, but now she's largely stopped. She stopped because she's no longer willing to translate, as in to replace or substitute or stand in for, or she just doesn't want to. A question of desire. She does not pass through, and neither does her language. Pasar de una lengua a otra, no, imposible, se dice sola en la cama. Her language, her bodies propagate and multiply. 9, a travesty. A travesty is exaggerated. A travesty is ludicrous, satirical, comic, a parody, burlesque. A travesty is poor, feeble, distorted, absurd, inferior. Can I tell you, it's a travesty that the word travesty has come to mean all of this in English? 10, immutability of skin offered as explanation. 12, body to fear unbound, imagination too expensive for unruly school children, performance of action postponed. 13, she turns off the parts of her brain that say, I don't write about myself, or I don't write anecdotes. She remembers how she'd joke with her friend in prison. Whenever a particularly tough or intense story would come up, they'd laugh and say in the visiting room, oh, you should write about that, or have you written about that? Or, oh, you must write about that. And they'd laugh, and why were they laughing? They were laughing at this idea that in order to be a writer, you just cobble together all the tough shit or all the juicy anecdotes and then make her deepest, darkest crevasses visible and legible, and boom, you have the writing. But what was so wrong with an anecdote anyway? What was so important about trying to make something that could pass as literary? Why make the goal be to write something that no one could understand, she thought. She didn't need to be understood, but she didn't need to be not understood either. 13.5. A feminine textual body is recognized by the fact that it is always endless, without ending, says Hélène Chichou. There's no closure, it doesn't stop. 14. Dream of deliverance was not bearing fruit. Nipple not exposed for long, second feather, unrelated. You weren't attempting to explain the photos. 14.5. She thinks that despite being a translator and avoiding her own unruly body, today here she is, she still has a body that is not conventionally legible, a body that now refuses to be replaced or to pass from one system to another seamlessly. She's in the seams, the weeds. She wants to be laying on concrete in the sun, soaking up its valley heat, listening to the river flow by. She makes an errant move to replace one word in a text she translated years ago. She makes a slight shift and then reads to herself out loud. No translating without bodies, no translating ourselves without bodies. We do not translate without bodies. No translating ourselves without bodies. We do not translate without bodies. No translating ourselves without bodies. We do not translate without bodies. No translating today without bodies. No translating you, no using you, no saying no, doing no, being no, uttering your body, without my body, without bodies, without heat, without the breathing bodies gone missing, without sound and words, without fingertips touching our bodies. 15. Lynn Heginian again. We live in toppled times under a feat of tyranny. Let's not fake getting lost. Let's do it. Let's not do it intermittently. Let's be lost, disoriented, and never to be bound so all can hear the hiss of the adverbs we shoot into tyrants' eyes. 15. Yet sometimes she is bound and happy. 18. Insert no transition here. Abrupt, disappeared. 20. If she is to return to translation, she thinks translation has to resist definition, resist instruction and correctness, resist slipping one body seamlessly into another, resist the equation of one thing with another, resist the assimilation of difference into sameness. 22. I like, how will she know the rivers, he texts her. She doesn't know she's crossed her sister's rivers. See, the river is a boundary line, but it is also a river, and the boundary lines are there in the middle, she supposes, but sometimes they are there. She supposes, but impossible to know that they are there. No way to know, no marker, digital or otherwise, except sometimes razor blades, sometimes buoys, remember? Sometimes this ain't Texas, ain't no hold'em. She's left to her own devices. 24. Instrumental Sophie hits different post-total testosterone evisceration, TTE. Y'all, somebody's gotta laugh at something. 26. The same friend writes to her from prison. I've switched to writing down these little anecdotes as if I'm journaling and not writing a letter to you. But these anecdotes are for you. 28. She left everything open and on purpose and as an aesthetic, and that openness, oh, that openness. 30. Hay que palabrarlo. You have to unword it all. Remember to unword it, he says, or unwind, and she translates. She comes at it sideways, and it is not a covering up, not an effort to make it difficult for no purpose. No, she comes at it sideways because 32. You will have become your worst nightmare. Will you please explain why your dreams of womanhood were never realized? 33. To think there is no possibility in the crossing, and still to cross. To look back at writing, from over a decade ago and realized she was obsessed with the bodies of these men in the river, how the body experienced the crossing, to realize she was always there, to realize the flip side was always there as well, the other side of the river, the border as metaphor. He tells her that he experiences the border as metaphor, and now he wants to move her there, like a doll, into a ranchito. La idea de usar el español aquí, la versión original de esto. ¿Cuál es la versión original si lo original fue suprimido desde una temprana edad? How do you say overlap en español? Le preguntó cruce. Ella dijo sole, y ella asentó con la cabeza. She wants to begin some initial investigations into this cruce. No, overlap es superposición, ella le corrige. 34. Maybe she is mistaken, but maybe there is a power in being a mistake and embracing it. But no, surely June Jordan is right when she writes, I am not wrong. Wrong is not my name. My name is my own, my own, my own. Of course, June Jordan is right. And yet, here we are, the terms not our own, especially shift over time. Words redefine and recontextualize endlessly, inhabit different languages. Words that sound the same but do not mean the same are often called false friends, faux amis, falsos amigos, falses amiguis, travesti, travesti, false friends, faux amis, falsos amigos, falses amigues. These colonial tongues full of proliferating false friends and doubled faces, the words to never quite fit on bodies, which makes her seem wrong perpetually. But because June Jordan is right, she will still say then, I am not wrong. Wrong is not my name. 35. Rediscover your childhood thrill of languages, none translatable. 36. Okay, she should be writing about translation, but she can't bring herself to. That was the assignment she was told, to write about crossing from one language to another. Fuck that metaphor, she thinks. What was lost and what was gained. Walking under that bridge, she was trying to explain to her new friends why she had no patience for the hyper-focus on what was lost. She's always walking under a bridge, never on the bridge, whether in her dreams or memories or reality or poems, under that damn bridge again. She hadn't seen Rosario in the snow in Juarez in years. She told her new friends, who perhaps were not friends, but something else she had no word for. She told them, typically when she taught translation, she was trying to get students to let go of the fear, let go of the idea that they could do it right, to try to envision other ways, other methods beyond faithfulness and inevitable loss. She remembers the Charlie Brown glass from her childhood. Why is having fun always so much work? 37. Incapable of imagining better futures, feather a shadow of your former self. 39. For a series of years, she talked about how she was a promiscuous translator, not a faithful one. How she was promiscuous and even polyamorous, and then the relationship between her and the original was one of love, and the relationship between her and the author was one of love. But now she was letting the love go, or realizing she was in love, but no one else was, or the author was not enwrapped in the metaphor of friendship nor love, or she was losing her way again. She was walking under the bridge, dirty ice and snow, some sleek and smooth in the gray day light, and some salty and dark from the sand. She was repeating something she had said many times before. Let's move beyond the fixation with loss. Let's look at what can be gained in the crossing. And then, just then, she couldn't be moved to believe what she was saying. She wanted to get back that believing, but suddenly she couldn't believe any of the words tumbling out of her mouth, and she could see the damned words as they tumbled, spiky and sugary and false. "40. Sandy Stone writes, but it is difficult to generate a counter-discourse if one is programmed to disappear. For her, translation had become a means to disappear. So then for her to generate a true, effective, and representational counter-discourse is to speak from outside the boundaries, beyond the constructed oppositional nodes which have been predefined as the only positions from which discourse is possible, beyond original and translation, beyond before and after, beyond the fucking glow up. 41. Her other sibling had given her a cloth with words embroidered on them. It said, "Let B be final." She'd look at it for days and days, let the words ring in her ears, and then she'd stand at the river's bank again. She'd look out at the crowd now assembled, some giggling at her, others just confused, some blank faces, some amused, others just lost, and she'd keep up her screaming. Why is a mouth who could also make mistakes? Why is urgent what is so ephemeral? 41. Because you hardly ever decided. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'd like to take the first few minutes of the Q&A to allow some space for our speakers to ask questions amongst themselves, if you would like to. So just kind of a brief pause to allow you all to converse. No pressure. It's not like public questions.
No, let's do private questions. Private questions in public.
And if you could,
Okay.
so it's not so private.
Yeah.
The mic, please.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious. How many languages did you find in Vietnam? How many languages are spoken there?
Well, so, I mean, I haven't done my own personal research on how many languages, but the kind of estimates are probably about 20. Well, I'm just topping to 17 among the detainee population and the whole 22 years that there has been one. And then Spanish and some other languages depending on who is in it.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about really is also the evolution of the Spanish that's spoken on the island, because the description you gave and what we know about this place tells us that it's isolated from the rest of the population.
Yeah.
Has the Spanish remained the same all through the years, or have there been significant changes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wish I could answer it. There has been movement. There's certainly been movement between Spanish on the people who speak Spanish on the base and their families back and forth from the US. There have been a number of Cuban. There's certainly been a number of kind of well-reported stories of Cubans who left Cuba but came back to the base as part of the US military because they, once they became American citizens, and so then, engaged with the Cubans on the base. But, I would imagine it hasn't evolved that much, except one little piece that I always think is really interesting is that because it's territorially part of Cuba, they get radio signals and TV stations from Cuba.
Right.
Just like people in that part of Cuba can get American TV from
Right.
the base. So, it creates these sort of weirdly little international spaces.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm trying to think of a question for you, Jay. I really appreciate your presentation. Think of a question. But I think there's so much of sort of translation and mistranslation working through your performance. And I think that where you ended when you said, because you never decided, was maybe key to those questions. But I wondered if you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
question. It's something about mistranslation. I guess I'm left thinking a lot about border zones too, from I think in all of our presentations. I hadn't necessarily thought about the border between Cuba and the United States in that region. And especially that thing that you're talking about radio stations going back and forth. Like, after living in Tijuana for many years and after living on the border in Texas for many years, like that's one of the things that calls out to me that when you're in a border zone is when you're listening to radio from the other side. And I imagine that happens. It's interesting. I'm also really interested in the way that audio came into your presentation. Audio is super important to me. WhatsApp messages and audio messaging and the ways that things can circulate outside of the written format is especially inspiring. So maybe there's something to say there in terms of the kind of decision to do a more performative talk. I think too is also to kind of bring a moment into the room where there is a body and there is a space, and to kind of remind people like we're in a space and we have a body in this moment. And I think especially in a university context, in an elite university context, that is kind of prerequisite number one, to kind of not talk about that or not deal with the fact that this is a space and that we have bodies, to kind of move on as if that didn't exist. And it says something to me about mistranslation, or it comes back to mistranslation, because I think so often, what was I reading? I can't remember. This is very typical of me. I was reading something about the ways that writing as an art form can be removed from bodies in a way that theater or music or other art forms can't be. So the work can travel in a way where the body is kind of removed. And the space of production is removed as well in many ways. Like it tends to float. And I think one of the things that happens then is that you can have you can get a sense that there's some kind of objective pronouncement that can be made, or that there's a correct way and a wrong way. And we forget that there are particular spaces and times, right? And that those spaces and times and those bodies that are involved in that process impact the language and create and kind of push back on an idea of correctness or wrongness in translation, which I think like I'm just imagining some woman sitting alone in Zimbabwe listening to the Shona story, and like the way that traveling changes the entire process, right? Yeah. Or then she decides to send it on WhatsApp to someone else and like, listen to this. Like,
actually, one of the things we wanted to do with the with the project as well was to transport stories away from their original spaces. So we could have had a Nigerian person translate it into another Nigerian language, but we thought, wouldn't it be more interesting again to have an African in a different, totally different environment, transport the story in many ways, not just in the language, but also in the context and everything else, and see how that changes the way it's perceived. And we may not be able to assess exactly how they perceive the story, but the idea that the story itself can move in that space is very interesting.
All right. Well, thank you. Sorry to put you all on the spot.
Okay.
So we'll open it up then to questions from the audience.
Someone there.
It's me. Thank you all for your presentations. I really enjoyed that session. I've got a question for Kola, which is,
Yes, please.
I was amazed that your number one reason for translating into African languages and into Yoruba was to build a corpus for the big tech companies. You know,
Well,
more
no,
than
no, not really.
No.
I'm sorry. I
and
hope
just
that's
in
not
your,
what
in your
they-
list. I mean, okay,
Okay,
yeah.
not for the tech companies.
Yeah.
But no, I'm happy you brought it up, and I
Yeah.
hope that was not what came across. My idea is to create a corpus for languages,
Yeah.
so that opportunities exist for those languages to be able to function in the world of technology.
Sure.
So anybody can build, I created a text-to-speech application for Yoruba by
Yeah.
myself, and I'm not paid by any tech company, just to allow people to be able to create, write a text and then generate an audio and send it to some friends and do stuff with it.
Yeah.
Just to be able to help this technological world not leave many languages behind. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely, and
Okay.
that's a kind of really interesting perspective. I just wondered how that went together with the other kind of reasons to translate, because I imagine if you're thinking, well, okay, I'm translating it with this destiny in mind, that might affect which text you choose to translate and how you do it, and that might be in conflict with
Yeah.
the ones you just like or the ones you think it would be most
Right.
interesting to share with people. I wondered how that was. for you.
Right. I am very interested in translation, generally. The work I did with Grosholz, the professor, it was a she reached out to me through someone that she's trying to find an African language and looking for an African translator. I said, well, I speak Yoruba. Is it good an African language for you? And she said, fine, let's do it. And then we did the work. And it was interesting and challenging for me because she was writing about snow and things that don't exist in the culture. And just being able to translate an idea to a new cultural environment is interesting. And at some point, I had to invent a word for snow, which didn't quite exist earlier. And dealing with the possibility that the word might catch on was quite interesting. And also, I realized as well, because I don't use Yoruba, as often as I should, because I started living in Lagos, which is a metropolitan space where there's so many ethnic groups and everybody speaks different languages. You have to use English to communicate. I realized while doing the work that there were some Yoruba words I had forgotten because I didn't use them as often. So just putting myself in the space to be able to engage myself and go back into places of my childhood and bring new words and create new things is interesting. And I hope that I could share that experience with many of the translators who are willing to go into their own languages and take works that exist currently around us and use that, to be able to exercise their own translation process. I found that interesting.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
What was the Yoruba translation of the word for snow?
Okay, so the before now, people had used this word yinyi, and yinyi means ice block. For snow, and I always found that really, irritating. That this is not what snow is. It's not just an ice block of ice, because that's closer to hail. So I was happy when I saw it. I was like, I'm going to create something. So I ended up with a word called irididi, which translates to frozen dew or frozen mist, something like that. Which I was able to defend as, I think it's closer to the word for snow than yeah.
Hi. It's really cool to see you, JD, in person because I've followed you for years on Twitter. I think you in Twitter, you kind of like mentioned that you had basically quit translation, and I was like, oh no, because and then in your presentation you kind of go into the reasons for why you're translating less.
She's translating.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and then I was like, oh, okay, those are good reasons to translate less because I would also like to divorce some of my authors. So I was wondering my question, I guess, is would you come back? What would compel you to translate more or come back to translation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am going to say what I read is cosplaying as fiction. So we're going to respect her costume and call it fiction. And I don't know. I say a lot of things on Twitter. I say way too many things. It's kind of become I don't know. It's become like a little psychoanalytic work group of one or something. So the fact that other people read it is always shocking and strange. So if I said that on Twitter, it sounds like a very kind of, what is it? What's the name? Is it Olson, the poet who in the middle of communist organizing in the 1930s or 40s kind of very famously stopped writing poetry. Am I right, Olson? I'm sorry, this is recorded. But it sounds like I'm making some kind of grand gesture, which I don't know. I'm interested in that gesture for her in the story and what that might mean. But I guess in the talk today, that the writing for today is coming out of this kind of very strange river of writing that's been flowing since December, but now I'm actually realizing that it's been there for a long time. I just hadn't had a forum to bring it out, so I've been experimenting with a lot of different forums to try and figure out how it moves into the world. And one of the things that I'm excited that's happening in the writing is allowing these contradictions to exist, right? So and questioning some of the stories that I've told myself or that I've repeated over the years. And now I've forgotten your question, but what would bring me back to translating? I think I still translate. I translate for money because I'm a freelancer. So, she's a whore. She does what she needs to do to get by. But so I couldn't actually economically stop. But I do think a lot of disappointment in the last years, coming from many different directions, politically, ethically, spiritually, psychologically, and like grappling with that and grappling, I guess, I had been so keen in my 20s to kind of stand up for the political potential of translation. I worked for a decade with a language justice collaborative called Antena Aire and Antena Houston, and language justice organizing to use interpreting and translation to create multilingual spaces. And I think in many ways there's a grappling with, especially I think living in Texas and living in a state that has been so fully taken over by fascism over the last, especially 20 years, at a time when we were working very hard in small ways to shift the dial. And so to come up all of these years later and see that how much we've lost. And so then maybe to have to grapple with that loss of faith, right? That loss of hope, but then that continuing to move forward. Or maybe not forward, but back again.
Yeah, I think it was when you quit Antena Aire, and I was like, oh, why would you do that? Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Yes, did.
Hi, I have a question for Kala. First, I'm like really excited to see you. I've like followed your work on like yorubaname.com for many years.
Oh, thank
but yeah, so I just had like a question. Since like I've been learning the Ekiti dialect of Yoruba for a couple of years now, and I've been like interested a lot in like translating the names. And I remember like you mentioning like the issue with like translating like Allah in like Yoruba names with like people tend to like my Yoruba name's Olalade, which people translate with like the wealthy person has come, but I like the translation more like the honorable person has come. But I was just wondering in like even like just like translating dialects like Ekiti that just have very little written works, and like your work in translating like English to Yoruba, I was wondering how you kind of like the idea of like you have to like you want to try and get as close as possible to the original translation, but you also don't want to lose the original meaning of like the names and trying to like translate them like cross-culturally. So I was just wondering what your ideas have been in like doing that in your work.
Thank you. So yeah, he's mentioned yorubaname.com, which I didn't spend some time on there. It's a dictionary of Yoruba names that I started working on in 2015. Actually, I started doing it as an undergrad, but we put it online in 2015. And it's an ambitious project to document all the names in Yoruba and their meanings in English. So it's kind of a translation project as well. And in doing that, one of the things I found out, of course, is that Yoruba is very diverse, like you mentioned, a number of dialects. Not just in Nigeria. If you go to Benin Republic, there's a lot of Yoruba people there who speak French as their first language and spell the names differently. And you go to Brazil and you find Portuguese spellings of Yoruba names, which are transited into that space because of transatlantic slavery, and Cuba as well. And so in doing the work, I discovered many of these and the way they're spelled, the way they're, sometimes the meanings have also evolved. And the work eventually then evolved as well into not just preserving how we write Yoruba names in Nigeria, which tends to be what happens when people center themselves, as the most important. There's some Yoruba people who tell you, the Yoruba spoken in Benin is not real Yoruba, or see someone in Cuba or Brazil speaking, in their own. Lukumi is the language that has evolved in Brazil. They say, no, that's not how it's done. But, as linguists, you recognize that evolution of language is as valid as, any other way of speaking. And so being able to recognize what's happening in different spaces and documenting as well is also part of what I found very interesting. And in doing that, you would notice that many of the names in the dictionary now have variants. So you see a name like Ariyayo, which is a standard Yoruba name. And if you another name called Ariyehun is an Ijebu name, but spelled differently, but it means almost the same thing because of the dialectal differences. So we try to accommodate as many of those as possible so that whoever encounters yorubaname.com gets almost a full experience of the different ways in which Yorubas express themselves in naming their people. Thank you.
One more question.
Oh, I see we're short on time. So I will make this incendiary question short. And this is again, Decola, forgive, it seems
No
like you're getting the
problem.
majority of questions.
Keep it coming.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really
Thank you.
enjoyed it. If any, with a sense of both the perils and the possibilities, what will happen as large language models include languages like Yoruba, for generative AI apps? And what is the role of Gen AI in the potential future of translation as a human, non-human interface? Or is it just a problem? Or I would be very curious to get your views on this.
I like the question very much because when I started advocating for language technologies in African languages, my biggest aim then was being able to have my grandfather, then who didn't speak a word of English, but who could read in Yoruba, to be able to use his phone in his language. There was a time we had this advocacy on Twitter to pressure Twitter to include Yoruba as one of the languages into which you could use the platform. At the time, they had this translation platform. They said they were including many other languages so that you could use the whole Twitter itself, the whole experience, the login, the tweet, etc., in different languages. That was before the other guy bought it and damaged the whole thing. Now, so they said yes to it, and they opened the platform, and we did a lot of translations. And my aim then was just to show the possibilities that big tech doesn't have to be limited to these big hegemonic languages. And my grandfather, who couldn't use his phone to text people, he had to call people to, because the interface was always in English. The ATMs in Nigeria you can't use unless you can speak in English. And so I was looking at the possibility of inclusion, basically just to make sure that more people in that space can use technology in whatever language they speak. But of course, now with AI and the way people have been using technology and the possibilities, the leaps that technology has taken now, I've reconsidered many of these ideas, and I'm very interested in the languages that don't get sucked into this big technology. It looks like they might have the advantage in the end because I think about opportunities. I mean, I've heard about this movie called Code Talkers, I think it was, where some Native Americans, I think, were used to generate codes, to help preserve some knowledge during the World War and stuff like that. And in the end, maybe when the machines take over now, the apocalyptic future, maybe it's the people whose languages don't get sucked into this place would be safe because then their knowledge systems are preserved and kept away. So these are very interesting things to think about, and I do think about them. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. That was the perfect segue into our next panel. So please stay around for it, which is Modes of Translation, Translation Technology in the Digital World. So we're going there in 15 minutes. All right, thank you.